we certainly recognize Martin Luther as the person who set off what is now called the Reformation, he was not the only one contributing to the Reformation landscape. There were a number of other reforms that were inspired and launched by Luther's thought and theology. In this episode, we're going to talk about the man who is considered to be the second in succession of mainline Protestant reformers, John Calvin.
As you might expect, as the second notable reformer, Calvin played a significant role in shaping the Protestant legacy and reputation. And while his thoughts and theology certainly influenced some of the European landscape, Calvinism especially took root as a significant influence in North American Christianity.
In the North American scene, some would say Calvin's stature and influence are equal to Luther's. In fact, in today's environment, overall, Calvin's theology has a greater following than Luther's. There are more denominations and congregation members who follow Calvin's thinking than Luther's.
So let's talk a little about his background in order to get a feel for how and why his influence is so great. Calvin was born on July 10, 1509 in Noyon in Picardy, northeast of Paris, France. He was born to an aristocratic family with sound financial means. And while he was a contemporary of Luther's, he was much younger. Thus, his Europe was radically different than that of Luther's.
When Calvin was born, Luther had already spent 4 years in the monastery. While Calvin was learning to read, Luther was delivering his lectures on the Psalms, Romans, and Galatians. He was a boy of 8 when Luther published the 95 Theses. The generation that separated them explains many of the new emphases Calvin brought into the theological conversation.
Calvin and Luther were also quite different in temperament. Broadly speaking, scholars have characterized the two as follows.
Calvin was shy to the point of diffidence, precise and restrained, except for sudden flashes of anger, and somewhat aloof.
Luther was sociable, free, and open, warm and cordial with people of all stations of life. To be clear, Luther did not have simply sudden, unpredictable flashes of anger. He was openly hostile at times.
But in spite of their differences in personality, Calvin and Luther retained a mutual respect for one another that was rooted in their confessional agreement. Many people have asked the question of how Luther regarded Calvin. What did he think about Calvin?
We know that in 1539, Luther was tremendously pleased with Calvin's open letter to Cardinal Sadoleto on why the Reformation was necessary. And in a letter of October 14 in that same year, Luther expressed his joy that Calvin was serving in Strasbourg at the side of his other friends. Melanchthon, too, reported that Calvin stood high in Luther's favor.
We also know that in April 1545, Luther took a copy of Calvin's Instruction and Confession of Faith from the shelf of Wittenberg bookstore, perused it, and observed, "The author is certainly a scholarly and pious man." Calvin, for his part, warmly defended Luther against detractors.
Calvin's development into the second man of the Reformation was in no way predictable.
The initial influences on his young life seemed to head him in quite the opposite direction, and his evangelical conversion seems almost to have caught even Calvin himself by surprise.
His father guided his son, John, toward an ecclesiastical career in the Roman Catholic Church.
When he was only 11, John was appointed to a chaplaincy attached to the altar of legalistic in the cathedral. At 18, he received the tonsure, although he was not ordained. And even though he was not ordained, he preached a number of sermons and seemed on his way to formally taking orders in the church. "I was," he commented many years later, "obstinately devoted to the superstitions of popery."
At that very point, however, Calvin began moving in the direction of a secular career. His father had a falling out with the Roman Catholic priests and came to favor the higher-paying law career for his gifted son. That dispute with the Roman Catholic clergy ultimately resulted in Calvin's father being under the ban of excommunication at the time of his death in 1531, something that must certainly have had an unsettling effect upon John as well.
Calvin went on to law school, and in the process was educated in the Studia Humanitatis school of thought. This humanist education which shaped the way he viewed and communicated the evangelical theology he would later take up. As part of the humanist education process, Calvin studied the classics, including reading the New Testament in the original Greek language. He was, by all accounts, a serious student of religion, and during his studies in law school, underwent some sort of epiphany or conversion to the evangelical theology.
In his preface to the commentary on the Psalms, Calvin wrote about his conversion experience as follows.
God, by a sudden conversion, subdued and brought my mind to a teachable frame, which was more hardened in such matters than might have been expected from one at my early period of life. Having thus received some taste and knowledge of true godliness, I was immediately inflamed with so intense a desire to make progress therein, that although I did not altogether leave off other studies, I yet pursued them with less ardor.
Calvin's account may give yet another insight as to why Luther and Calvin would eventually differ in their religious assertions and positions.
For Luther, the process was much more of an evolution out of anxiety and angst, Anfechtung as he called it. Luther wasn't deciding to move away from what he had been reared, but was more or less pushed away.
So one could say Luther's change was more a matter of the heart or conscience that drove him away. Whereas for Calvin, it was much more of a deliberative process. He was more of an analytical convert rather than emotional convert.
When Calvin arrived on the Reformation scene, Luther's ideas and assertions were in the process of being, and some would say, needed to be, systematized and set in order. Calvin was the man for the job. His approach, skill set, and education resulted in him taking what Luther started and crafting it into something that would determine his own legacy.
There are two distinct ways the differences between Luther and Calvin can be illustrated. To begin with, Calvin's most notable writing, the Institutes, serves as an example. The first edition of Calvin's Institutes was published in March 1536. Few scholars in Christendom have written so much with such tremendous consistency. And yet, in a very special sense, Calvin was a man of one book, the Institutes. As a systematic presentation of Christian theology, it became the handbook of militant Protestantism and exercised an enormous influence on Western thought among friends and foes alike.
All his life, Calvin worked at improving the Institutes. Only 3 years after the first edition, the second edition of 1539 was twice the size, the first, and the 8th edition of 1559 was twice the size of the 7th. Through these editions and some 25 publications, there is amplification but very little change. Its theological core remains substantially unaltered.
Let's take a look at the Institutes now and what they contained specifically.
The first edition was divided into 6 books with topics on the law, faith, prayer, sacraments, false sacraments, Christian liberty, ecclesiastical power, and civil liberty.
The way Calvin organized his work illustrates some of the differences between him and Luther. Simply put, the way they each structured their writing is an easy distinguishing characteristic. Luther, when writing, never systematized his work. Rather, most everything came out as proclamation. Thus, his main theological treatises functioned as much like a sermon as anything. Whereas for Calvin, much like Melanchthon, his humanist background resulted in his use of the Lotzi method to make his points. Arguments and information were structured to be memorized in a logical framework.
A second way of noting the difference between the two men can be seen in their views regarding the church. As you may know, Luther understood the church to be where the people are gathered together around the proclaimed word and sacraments. There was no specific structure necessary or inherent to the church. The only thing that mattered, as far as Luther was concerned, was the proclamation of the gospel.
Calvin's ecclesiology, his ideas regarding the nature of the church, vary little from those found in medieval times. This is evident in Book 4 of the Institutes. Calvin maintained the distinction between the visible and invisible church. The invisible church, he said, is comprised of the elect people whom God chose from the beginning, and only God knows who they are. Unity, holiness, and Catholicity are marks of the invisible church for Calvin.
The visible church, according to Calvin, is comprised of all of the people around the world who profess one God and Christ. He adopted Augustine's notion of the assembly as a permixtum of sinners and saints. He used the idea to combat the Anabaptists of that time, who wanted to separate the holy from the unholy. Calvin refused that separation and deemed schism in the church as sin.
This points to Calvin's view that the church is an institution which is governed by a hierarchy comprised of a fourfold ministry. And while Calvin's ideas are similar to Rome's, especially with respect to the emphasis on an institutional hierarchy, he maintained a polemical edge. He cited the Augsburg Confession's emphasis on true doctrine as his foundation. The error of the papacy, according to Calvin, was to deviate from the scriptures.
And while this may sound very much like Luther's assessment of the papacy, Calvin's assessment was different. Calvin was not referring to the function of the kerygma and the doctrine of the law and the gospel, as Luther had laid it out.
Rather, Calvin saw Scripture as a prescription of what to do and not to do. And since there was no firm scriptural evidence that the Pope should be the head of the Church, Calvin accused Rome of not holding true doctrine.
It is very important to know how similar Luther and Calvin were in the language they used and some of the principles they taught. It's easy to find agreement between the men, and we have no historical accounts of any disagreement or animosity one had for another.
Even so, we do know that their colleagues and heirs did not always see eye to eye, and their perspectives on the content and the consequences of each reformer's work and principles are likely the reason why.